I want to start with quite a general question. What we've heard is a view in a security environment that is changing. We have very many different hazards close to us and around us in different fields and different areas, and we also see that we have different threat assessments within NATO and within that will be tackled during this ministerial meeting. We also know historically that NATO has and has been well prepared and has previously changed strategic concepts in order to meet new challenges. So my first question is quite general. What do you see as the way forward with this meeting? What do you see? Do you see any outcomes or expectations from this ministerial meeting? And we can start with you, General Ataman.
Well, I think that everyone is getting a benefit from all this, what's being said here. We have to be hopeful, first of all. There is no room for a black picture, because without hope, you will not get anywhere. Maybe a few years back, as was mentioned during Lisbon, our vision, NATO's vision, was a little bit more optimistic about relations with Russia. But since the events which took place last year, well, that view had to be changed. But the important thing is that the public in general, in all our countries, are not really too much interested in all this. Everyone is in daily business, the hardships of life, and such things as the events in Ukraine or far off Syria, Iraq, ISIS, and so on, and all that. They're too far away. That's news on TV. But for how long? Suddenly, you might find that it's right at your door, as 9/11 showed. The Atlantic, the transatlantic distances. Who could even dream that such an event could take place right in the middle of New York? Well, I think that's true for each and every one of us. I'll give you a funny example from my own background training. At one stage in the British Staff College, we were in the middle of a war game, and the theme was Northern Ireland. So there were two sides in the war game: the security forces and the representatives of the IRA. And I was an IRA member. So we had to come up with certain plans to disrupt the daily life in London. We could dream up of all sorts of things. And this was also being televised by real BBC speakers on the news in a closed circuit TV. One thing we did, for example, was to open up the gates in Safari Park and let out all the wild animals into the streets of London. So there was this lady who was phoning the operations center. She was saying that there was a giraffe looking into her bathroom on the second floor. This is funny, but in real life, there is asymmetry in the threats and between the threats and the security forces. This is why now we're talking about hybrid threats. Well, this is what it is. You could do this sort of thing very cheaply, but you can cause a lot of damage, and you could disrupt everything in the country's daily life. So I think what we ought to take home is that it's our duty for each and every one of us to convince our public opinion that in real life you have to make some sacrifices from your welfare. This is hard for politicians, of course. The worst thing in a democratic country for a political leader is to spend money on defense, while there are other requirements in health, education, infrastructure, and everything. That is why I'm saying that you have to follow very closely what's going on in Ukraine. Could that be that there may be a spread of such events into other parts of the country? After all, I mentioned the irredentist awakening. How far could that reach? We don't know yet. If you go back into history, similar things happen. So you have to take lessons from history. If you don't take lessons from history, well, it will repeat itself. I think I'll leave it at that.
Absolutely. You mentioned public opinion, and one of the main reasons that we are here is in order for us to go back to our regional offices and national offices and create debate and stimulate debate and take the messages from this ministerial meeting in order to stimulate debate in our home countries. I have a question for Mr. Whiteside. What do you see? How can organizations such as ATA and YARA, how can we help to communicate the message from the ministerial meetings when we go back to our home countries?
What I'd see is two things, and I hope that you'll be in a position to do this after the next 2 days. First of all, nobody, whether you're a young audience or an older audience, wants a lot of blah, blah, blah. Nobody wants that. If you want to be a good communicator, you have to speak in really simple terms. So I would hope, to answer your question, that when you go back to your capitals, you put things in simple perspectives for the groups you work with and the people you interact with. This ministerial is essentially about two simple things. It's about a readiness action plan, the RAP, to ensure that people understand the deterrence and the credibility of the alliance vis-a-vis Russian actions in and around Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia. The RAP's the message. You don't need to talk too much about this. Reassurance, readiness action plan, the two words go together. Reassurance action plan, readiness action plan, they both give you RAP. Key message. Make sure your communication's simple. The second issue for this ministerial is talking about partnership. Defense capacity building is a form of partnership. Working with Jordan is an expression of partnership. Working with Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova are expressions of partnership. The world works on partnership. So when you go back, if I can answer your question simply, take 2 or 3 messages and always hit those same messages, because they're fundamental. They're the building blocks of everything we do. And they represent the values that we stand for: partnership and deterrence. So that's a very short answer, what I would hope you do when you go back to your respective capitals in your languages.
Thank you. Concerning this, we've been hearing you speak a lot about disinformation and misinformation and the challenges that we're facing with not only the amount of information that is out there, but also wrongful information. Mr. Meyer, do you have any remarks concerning strategic communication and how we can face the challenges of misinformation and PSYOPs?
Yeah. Well, it's not an easy task, as I said. Because we are working with many detailed information, and as Mr. Whiteside said, sometimes we are going to too much details and not spreading the main message. And the main message is commitment. The main message is common values. Now we are not clear enough, or it's not clear for us whether people share in the countries of NATO, whether they share the same values. Of course, they can have different perception of the threats and different positions towards some particular issues, but are we still committed in the values which are written in the North Atlantic Treaty and which are the baseline for our democracies? This is I'm quite optimistic that we are still committed, but based on the events I mentioned, it's not clear whether it is still so. So we are working, especially in Slovak Atlantic Commission and Central European Policy Institute as two sister organizations. We are working quite hard spreading these kind of messages. So it's not only creating or organizing roundtables of experts and people who are developing policies, but it's about spreading this message with media. So that's why we are working quite often with media on personal level, but organizing breakfasts or lunches with media to share, because we don't have to like media, but we all know that they are crucial in spreading this kind of information, and now it is crucially important. Of course, there need to be a combination of the effort and cooperation of state service, state sector, media, and NGOs. So once this comes together, the positive outcome is more probable. For example, in the case of Slovakia and my organizations, we use the opportunity of organizing GLOBSEC conference as one of the biggest conferences. So I'm not making advertisement, but it's about this, putting important people together in very specific time and specific location, and to discuss and to put these messages, the outcomes of the conference, to the media. So we are happy that we've got about 200 or more than 200 accredited journalists from all over the world. So these are it's not easy task. It's comprised of many small things, and all the effort should be combined. So it's not about working with Slovakia, working with Czech Republic, working with Belgium separately, but all these activities and this Youth Ministerial Summit is a great example of that. Putting the people together to exchange the views and then to share in as simple as possible way further, not only to media but to the all public we are meeting with in our families, in our networks.
Mr. Whiteside, with your background, do you have any additional remarks on strategic communication and how to reach it, and what instruments would be necessary? Or
there's a lot of success in what Alliance has done. I think we also have to be quite humble and modest, because there's been failures too. If you look back at the story of how we've built a relationship with the Afghan government and the Afghan people, this has been difficult. And we come back to a word which is used a lot, and that is to create a relationship to win the hearts and minds of people. Public diplomacy isn't just with the intellectuals out there, it's also to ensure that people who are not interested in security understand the fundamentals of what the Alliance has been trying to do. And that's sometimes quite difficult. We see in Afghanistan today that a great portion of the population, despite our best efforts, have never understood this message. We still have work to do there. We see even in the Balkans, and we saw this over the weekend, again with the violence in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, there's violence there which shows again how fragile all of these relationships are, not only to NATO, but to the values of the international community. So this is an ongoing task. There's no end to all of this work. And it's certainly something which we need to invest in. Public diplomacy costs money. Public diplomacy costs your capitals money, and it costs money to the Alliance. I think it's a good investment.
thank you very much. I would like to, before open up for some questions, I see some hands in there. If we start with the gentleman here on the first floor.
From the OSCE mission in Baku. First of all, I'd like to thank
I think there's a microphone just right behind.
I'd like to thank all three speakers. My question would be to Mr. Whiteside. Actually, the approach that you introduced, I think, will stick with me for quite some time, of bringing in together time and distance. And I wanted to actually try to bring together like the times, the post-World War II era when the NATO alliance was established with the current times. And it seems like back then it was not a challenge to meet the 2% threshold, because then there was a different generation that was a lot more resilient, and they saw the real challenges and the security threats were obvious. And there was actually a joint enemy of the Soviet Union that kind of brought the alliance together. But now it seems like actually we should kind of give credit to those who are responsible for the security, because the general population feels secure and safe, so they don't feel responsible enough to invest in the security as much as maybe they should. In part, maybe the fact that most of the NATO countries have switched to professional armies, that has heavily contributed to this, because now there's this gap between the military sector and the civilian sector. So very often the general public is unaware of the sacrifice and the challenges of the military or of the security personnel who commit so much for providing this secure environment. So what do you think would be the best way to kind of reduce that gap between the public and military? So I know that there have been actually some remarks in this regard, but could you elaborate a little bit more? Maybe there could be some mechanism for the military to explain, kind of to bridge that gap with the civil sector. Could you please answer that, Mr. Whiteside, and then if you could contribute, I would also appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, it's a really good question. How do we reach out and explain to people who are fundamentally not very interested in these issues, why this 2% benchmark is important. I think there's two tracks which we need to follow. First, we need to give the simple analogy. What would the world be like without security and stability? And the analogy is, what would your city be like without the police? Would you be seeing investment in your city without the police? Would you be seeing a sense of certainty for people walking the streets late at night if there were no police? Would you see a sense of overall justice if there were no police to apprehend perpetrators, criminals? We need to bring this back to really grassroots level. People understand their city, they don't understand the international context. There can be no economic growth in any country if the country is not stable and secure. You know that one of the key messages during the 15 years of the Afghanistan campaign was the following: there can be no security without good governance. There can be no good governance without economic growth. You have this triad. You cannot have economic growth if you don't have good governance. But good governance relies on stability, relies on investment. This comes back to the 2%. The problem with the 2%, and you're right to point to it, is that it sounds very arbitrary. But it has been demonstrated that if you're not spending roughly 2%, you're not going to have an army that you can deploy. But here is where we enter into one more fact which you as young leaders should carry away. It's not just the 2%. It's the 20% of what you are spending on defense has to be spent on modern equipment. So it's a 2% plus 20% of that has to be on modern equipment. Otherwise, you're just paying people to walk around in uniforms. They won't have the right equipment, and that's the message you need to bring back to your populations, back to our capitals, to say it does not suffice to spend money up until 2%, but it has to be wisely spent. It has to be spent on equipment which allows you to reach out and to affect military operations. So my answer, bring it back to the grassroots and use an analogy like your city. What would the city be like without firemen, without policemen? That's what a state looks like without its own capable security forces.
Thank you. Would you like to add something general to this question?
Well, yes, if I may. In the early 80s and before that, the target 2% during the Cold War was 3%. NATO had a long-term defense program, as it was called then. But I can assure you that even if that was the Warsaw Pact threat against West Europe, that 3% was never reached. And we had similar complaints that we are discussing. So I think it's really a matter of understanding the problem. If we cannot convince the people, whether it's 2%, if you reduce it to 1%, again, you will see similar problems. So I think it was rightly said that without police, without firemen, imagine a city. And from that point, I'd like to come back to the military and the civilian issue. Well, fortunately, in Turkey, we have not adopted a fully professional system yet. We still have the national service, military service for young people. I think military service, at least for my own country, is the linchpin between the society and the military, because if we have a son, a boyfriend in the military, you'll always have an interest in what's going on, and because you'll feel concerned about him or her. Besides, for not too serious threats, like a peacekeeping operation, where casualties would be minimum, hopefully, then you don't have a problem with a professional army, because, okay, you'll have maybe 1, 2, 3 casualties, but you can compensate that. But in a major war, you have a limited number of professionals that you send out there. But when you have too many casualties, then you're going to have major problems to replace them. I think the United States lived this problem in Iraq, because when there is no threat, you can easily find volunteers for your military service. But as casualties rise, then it's, for the young people, it's not a very good idea to join the military just for pay, because your life is at risk. So after a while, you begin to lower your standards for intakes on the volunteer basis. So you will end up perhaps in a situation where you will have to hire mercenaries to carry out your job, and that's very dangerous too. So I'll leave it with that.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I know we have many questions, and I have a list here for a couple more, and I know during the coffee break we will have the opportunity to ask our speakers further. I know there are many intelligent thoughts in this room. I just want to continue with one question received here. What do you expect to be the outcome of this ministerial meeting? If we start with Mr. Meyer, do you have any comments on that?
Well, we discussed it a little bit before. I expect as far as I know, there's quite a wide array of topics which ministers will be interested in. But I see two most important outcomes, and actually Mr. Whiteside already mentioned them, or maybe three. The first should be the realistic assessment of the security situation, which is not very good, and which is even worsening, I would say, from different sides, from the south, from the east, and maybe some problems also inside of the countries. The second assessment, I think it should be positive assessment, despite of what I said in my remarks. Positive assessment of readiness action plan, because that is the way of showing our preparedness for the future threats, and current and future threats. And third, the position or the commitments towards partners, especially Ukraine. So as far as I know, there should be some announcement of trust fund and different tools of another trust fund and different tools of the help to Ukraine and maybe other countries. So I see these three outcomes as the most important, and what should be behind is to show our commitment to secure our alliance, not only alliance itself, but also neighborhood, and this message needs to be very clear, and this message needs to be spread by all of us, including NATO HQ, but including all of us in capitals.
Absolutely. And with those words, I think that's a very good wrap up for this